If you're into building electric guitars, you should stick around. We're deep in the process of building a guitar inspired by Jimmy Page's Dragon Telecaster. I'm going through the build step by step, using the simplest tools and techniques so you can follow along and build a guitar yourself. So stay with me, let's build a guitar. Hi, I'm Yoav and this is the Electric Luthier. Today we'll continue the build of a Tele style guitar we started in the first 4 parts of this series. This is my homage to Jimmy Page's 59 Tele, which started out as Jeff Beck's white blonde Tele and ended up with a unique dragon painting. Today I will take the final steps before giving it a clear coat, installing the nut, and starting to put it all together. I've also found a fairly original solution for the pickguard. So let's pick it up where we left off and jump on to the nut. I'll be using a synthetic bone nut, and I figured since I made the whole fretboard myself, I might as well make a nut from a blank one. I've already cut 2 slots between which my nut would sit. I'll use a thin sharp chisel to take out the material between the 2 slots. I'll do it carefully not to damage my nice fretboard. I'll at least try. You can get a pre-made plastic nut. They're cheap and they work. Most production guitars use them. I don't think a somewhat vintage style Tele would require a metal or a locking nut. And with my thick fretboard, a nice chunky nut will work well. After the bulk of the material was removed, I will file the bottom smooth. If you don't have a designated file, I just tape off the sides and just use the edge. Now I need to mark it, cut it, and shape it. To give me a good sense of the height I need for the nut, I'll sand a pencil to the point the lead is flush with the bottom, pretty much in half across. I'll use this later to mark the minimal height for the slots as well. After roughly marking the width and shape of the nut, I put a bit of masking tape to protect it from the vise, and I start to cut and file it. I mark the bottom with a little arrow facing to the headstock so I don't lose my orientation after sanding all the other marks. I go back and forth and finalize the shape with files and sandpaper. The top of the nut should follow the radius of the fretboard. Be an extra millimeter or 1/16 of an inch taller than the fret and have a slight slope towards the headstock side, just like the strings will have. When it's ready, I'll put a dab of glue to just hold it in place. If you did a better job than I and it sits tightly in the groove, you may not even require any glue. It's time for marking for the slots. First, the height. The simplest tool for that is the pencil I've sanded. Make sure the tip is sanded so that the very tip is flush with the bottom and not rounded like a normal pencil. And then slide it over the 2 first frets so it marks the exact same height on the nut. When slotting, you do not want to go below this line. If you're aiming for a very low action and your frets leveled, this may later be your slotting mark. Next, we want to mark the first and last slots for both the low and high E strings. I simply measure 1/8 of an inch, which is a hair under 2 millimeters, from both sides. To get accurate marks, I scribe it with a scalpel blade. You can use any sharp blade, and then go over it with any water-based marker. Then I wipe it off and only the thin line inside the blade mark remains. To mark the other 4 slots, you can simply divide by 5 and mark it. But in theory, the correct distance should take into account the thickness of the strings themselves and then space it accordingly. If all that math makes you want to pull your hairs, there's a nifty tool for just that. It's called a string spacing rule, and it has markings that can match any neck. The spacing changes along the ruler, and all you have to do is slide it until you find the spot where the highest and the lowest strings align. Mine even has the instructions embedded on it. I'll link it below. I marked the other 4 strings with a scalpel and marker. This also gives me a starting point for the slotting itself. I'm going to make the initial slots for the correct position, and I'll use this one size sharp slot cutter. I'll make the more precise slots after stringing, and I'll demonstrate other options as well as this relatively cheap set you may have come across. Our neck is now ready for clear coating, and it's time to mask my fretboard. Fender have traditionally clear coated most of their necks with variations of materials and glossiness. I'm going to use polyurethane with a silky matte finish for both the neck and the body. It's the type you can get at your local hardware store and may probably be able to find the same or equivalent in a spray can. I'll be setting both the body and the neck on my very sophisticated painting devices. This is also a chance to see how this new electric spray gun I have stands up to the challenge. And yes, I know I need a better painting space, but I personally gravitate more towards using oils and not sprays on guitars, so I keep putting it off. I don't, and you shouldn't either, compromise on mouth or nose protection. My plan is to give it 2 or 3 coats about 15 minutes apart, and then give it a day or 2 to dry before I sand it. By the way, please hit the subscribe button and the bell beside it to get notified when my next video is coming out. And do come and check my website, theelectricluthier.com, where you will find related articles and much more. The first couple of coats came out a bit thicker than I wanted, so I'll leave it 2 days and let it dry. After a couple of days, I came back to check it out and give it some light sanding. My first coat is generally okay and even, but it did come out with larger droplets than I would have wanted, and that gave it what is called the orange peel look. I'm going to give it a light manual sanding with 1200 to 1500 pad. I love pads for manual sanding. They feel much better, and I feel they give much better contact to the surface, especially with all the curves. I'm not trying to take off too much of the coating, just remove any bumps and soften the orange peel. The following coats should even it out even better. For the neck, I'm going to give it a bit more of sanding since smoothness is a priority here. I'll first use an 800 grit to really remove any inconsistencies. I don't mind taking off as much of the coating as necessary in this case. Since this gun is not using a compressor, it behaves a little differently. I'm switching to a smaller nozzle for the next coat. My second round will have 3 coats with about 15 minutes between them. And even when wet, it already looks better than the first. I again let it dry for a couple of days. It's been relatively cool and humid, and then take it to the bench. For my neck, I feel this is just enough. I may do a bit more work and paint it on the headstock when I put the logo on, not the Fender logo, but that can wait. Masking tape off, and I give it an all-around sanding with a 1200 and then an 1800 and even 2000 grit paper. These will hardly do anything to the thickness of the clear coat, but just soften the feel. Then I use white spirit to give it a cleanup and also remove residue from the masking tape, which has been there for longer than it probably should. The body now has a thicker matte coat with much less orange peel. I'll give it another thorough sanding with 1200 pad and get it ready for the next round. Third time around, I'm giving it 3 more coats with about 15 minutes between each coat for it to get tacky enough for it not to run, but soft enough for it to bond with the next layer and build up to one thick and smooth layer when all 3 cure together. While the paint dries, I'll attempt to give the pickguard a metallic layer and also a slight adjustment to better fit the extended neck. If I was doing a 21 fret neck, I'd probably not have to do this. I'll sand and extend the width of the opening in the transparent pickguard I got. I'm trying to keep the protective film on it as much as I can. After the shape is okay, I'll use regular white glue to attach aluminum foil to the back of the plate, hoping it will dry transparent to give the desired effect. It worked for Jimmy. Otherwise, I'll just buy a mirror version. After the third layer, you can really see the buildup and all the little blemishes are fading away. I'm thinking of one last layer. With a spray gun of any kind, it takes time to get the hang of it. And I think I'm kind of getting this one by now. I'm giving it 3 more coats, each one about 15 minutes apart. I'm trying to get the best coverage I can while maintaining the lightest coat I can get each time. This way, I keep building up the layers more evenly and avoiding dripping and puddles. I'm really trying to take my time with this one. Since I'm going for a matte finish, there should be no more sanding or buffing after these layers. After the clear coat is dry, it's time to start putting it all together. And I'll start at the top with the tuners. I've got a set of vintage style tuners. The holes I've drilled seem just a tiny bit too small now, and I'll use a Reamer to slightly enlarge it. Using a drill at this point may cause tear out as well as damage the clear coat, and it's probably not even necessary as far as the size goes. I still want the furrows to fit tightly, and I think the slightly angled cone shape of the Reamer will provide just that. After a couple of tests, I marked the depth on the Reamer itself to get some consistency. I again used the toy hammer, and it seems to give the exact amount of force I need here. Maybe you should have one of these laying around. It's not completely useless. I rim all 6 holes and elegantly hammer in the furrows. Onto the tuners themselves. They fit quite loosely, so there's enough playroom to get there awkward. I'll use a ruler to align them and mark the placement of the holes for the tiny screws. These vintage tuners are designed so that every 2 edges are held by 1 screw, except the first and the last one. So there's not much room for errors. I'm always afraid of these little screws. You don't want to skip pre-drilling them and risk damaging the headstock. But on the other hand, they're so easily stripped if over-tightening or drilling. This is why I decided to use this hand drill, which has been in my family since I can remember. And if not for Ben Crow from Crimson Guitars, I would have never even considered using it. Thank you, Ben. Thank you for that and for so many other things. I drilled them all, aligned the tuners, and started putting the tuners in place. The tuners are now all in place and all seems to be in order. Well, almost. A couple of the screws, as expected, feel like they're on the verge of giving in, and I decided to give them a slight reinforcement in the shape of some glue and sawdust. I would say the neck is now ready and I can move to the body. I'm going to put some copper lining in the switches cavity. I'll attempt to make it in one piece for better conductivity and all that, but that never really works. Plus, the copper tape itself is not even wide enough. I'll do the best I can with the one piece and then just add a couple of more smaller pieces to cover it all. I leave the edges out a little bit to make contact with the metal cover. When I come to connect the neck to the body, I know that it's not as snug as I want it to be, and I want to hold it in place with the back plate when drilling and screwing them together. I'll attach the plate with masking tape and also tape a piece of scrap MDF to protect it from the clamp. I pay attention to not cover the holes with the clamp and then I flip it over. On the fret side, I put some padding and use the radius block to get a good grip without putting too much pressure on the frets themselves. Now I can comfortably and safely drill the neck and screw it tightly. Hey, this looks like a guitar. This is time to address the pickguards. There are two issues with the plate. The first is the size. Only after painting the dragon I've noticed that Jimmy's 59 Telecaster pickguard had an extra long tail, and I couldn't find one of these even on the Fender website. The second issue was that my attempt to glue aluminum foil to the back of the transparent pickguard was a total failure. Let's keep it at that. I'm trying to keep this channel profanity free. The only choice left was to make my own pickguard. The pickguard had to fit the guitar and have the 59 tail, and it had to have a metallic look, so I decided to go metal. Being more of a wood person, I was happy to find a nice piece of scrap, about 2.5 millimeters sheet of aluminum. I started by marking the shape, and after a few tests decided to go with a combination of drilling, cutting with a disc, grinding, and filing. I tried the jigsaw with a metal blade, but it was a bit too thick to cut comfortably. I might use it just for very thin places. I drill with the appropriate radius wherever possible and roughly cut as close as possible with a thin grinder. You can get quite accurate with the straight lines, but the rounder parts will need much more filing and sanding later. Aluminum, or aluminium, is a much softer metal than stainless steel or iron, and is also much lighter. It will be challenging to get the right shape and shine, but it seems right for this guitar. So, challenge accepted. This 2.5 millimeter or roughly 1/18 of an inch is not that different to file and sand than some of the harder woods I've come across, and the bulk of the work was just manually filing the edges. After getting the correct shape, I filed a nice bevel around the edge in all the areas the same as the original. And then it's back to sanding. I started with about 400 grit to remove all the filing grooves and scratches, and then moving up to 600, 1000, 1500 and even 2000. I think I'll do a more detailed video just for the plate. The next part is polishing. I used the same polishing paste I have for the frets and put probably way too much. After removing and spending some time buffing it, it came out to the desired shine. It pretty much rivals stainless steel, and I'm sure that if I had higher grits of sandpaper with a better buffing wheel and compound, I could have even matched the chrome plating of the bridge and the pickups. But that's not what I was going for, and I'm very happy with the result. The thickness is similar to the original plate, and it weighs just a bit more. Not something that would make the guitar heavy. We now have all the parts ready, the head and the neck attached, and all we need is some soldering to put the electronics together. Aside from my natural solderophobia as a woodworker, I still have some parts taking their time in the mail. Join me next time when I put it all together with whichever electronic components I manage to get my hands on, and hopefully string and set up this dragon of the guitar. Until then, if you want more information on guitar building, articles and downloads, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified. Check out the links below and come visit us at theelectricluthier.com.